1929 and the kulaks are in trouble. Who were the kulaks, you ask? Well, the kulaks were farmers, specifically wealthy farmers who lived in the USSR, whose leader, Joseph Stalin, didn't appreciate their acquired wealth or their objections to his policies. The policy that the kulaks particularly disliked was collectivization. This was the process of forcibly taking land from individual peasant farmers and combining them with others under joint control, but under the close watch of the government. These farms, kolkhozes, were ideally supposed to be more efficient and could produce much more food for the growing cities of the Soviet Union. Shockingly, peasants who had been given their land by Lenin were unhappy at having it taken away from them, and so naturally they resisted. These people weren't given much of a choice though, and many were either deported, beaten until they acquiesced, or were simply shot. Over the next 3 years, over 300,000 kulaks were deported either to faraway settlements or to work camps. So collectivization had one major flaw: it didn't work. Crop yields on collective farms were lower than individually held ones, and in 1931 and 1932 grain yields dropped precipitously. There were many reasons for this, such as bad weather, pests, and the fact that people with farming knowledge had just been sent to work camps. The decline in crop yields was particularly severe in Ukraine, which had seen much higher rates of collectivization. Shockingly, without crops there was less food, and less food meant starvation and famine. Stalin was further embarrassed when Ukrainian peasants fled the USSR for Poland and quickly spread word of the famine to the wider world. Side note, it's worth noting that the famine didn't simply affect Ukraine, it was widespread throughout the USSR but mostly affected the south. So how did the Soviet government respond to the famine? The government created a bread ration for major cities like the Ukrainian capital of Kharkov, but those in the countryside, i.e. those who grew the food, were left with little. Interestingly, those who had previously been deported to forced labour camps were often given larger daily rations than those who worked on the farms or lived in the cities. Lazar Kaganovich, Stalin's second in command, ordered Stanislav Kosyr, the leader of the Ukrainian Communist Party, to crack down on the peasantry. The government was concerned that starving Ukrainians fleeing Ukraine were demoralising the rest of the USSR and would make collectivization and thus Stalin look bad. As such, the government chose to pull back on collectivization in Ukraine, and just kidding, they banned people from moving throughout the USSR and denied that any famine was happening. Furthermore, any discussion surrounding starvation was seen through the lens of it being a hunger strike orchestrated by Polish spies and Ukrainian nationalists. Also, during the famine, the Soviet Union was still exporting grain, and simply halting this or opening up the nation's extensive grain reserves would have alleviated a great deal of the suffering. Stalin didn't want to though, since the money raised from selling grain was used to build heavy industry across the nation. This period, known as the Holodomor or the Terror Famine, continued until 1933, when crop yields began to increase and were able to feed the now much lower population. Estimates vary, but the death toll of the famine in Ukraine is considered by historians to be at about roughly 3 million. In fact, when the USSR conducted a census in 1937, the figures for the population were lower than anticipated, and so Stalin had those who compiled it shocked. The big debate surrounding this event is whether or not it should be labelled as a genocide, and to what extent who was responsible. That, however, is a debate for another video. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching, and a special thanks to all of these patrons you see on screen for their generosity in supporting the show, and a particularly special thanks to James Bisonet, Party Boyko, Michael Reynolds, Gustav Swan, Winston Kaywood, Sky Chappelle, Adam Harvey, Gabe Ellery and Azarka Flash.